Hello and welcome back to Parc Fermé Parlay with Kieran Downey. Bloody hell, what a race. What a race that was. Jesus. We're here to talk about the Sao Paulo GP. That was a banger. That was an absolute banger of a race. There's just something about Brazil. It always provides every single year. And actually, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of sprint weekends. I'm not a big fan of this whole format. However, I'd happily take a sprint race in Brazil every year. I think I'd genuinely be happy if we had a sprint race in Brazil every year. Banger from start to finish. Let's get right into it. First up, we have Cyber and Gabriel Bortoleto, who qualified for the sprint in 14th, did not finish, didn't set a time in qualifying and did not finish the main race. And Nico Hulkenberg, who qualified for the sprint in 10th, finished 15th, qualified for the main race in 10th and finished 9th. I suppose we could start with Gabriel Bortoleto because it was a complete disaster for Bortoleto this weekend. I feel so bad for him. I feel really bad for him. It's his first home race and it just couldn't have gone any worse. It really couldn't have gone any worse. It's not great qualifying for the sprint, and then he crashes in the sprint race right towards the very end. We didn't actually see it because we were too busy watching Lando Norris driving round the track after he'd already won. We were just watching an onboard of him, whilst there was still plenty battling happening out on track, which I have to say is something I think they recognised and changed for the main race, because when Lando crossed the finish line for the main race, they went straight into showing all the other battles that were happening in every other car crossing the finish line because it was so tight. Anyway, Bortoleto was stuck in a DRS train coming into turn 1. I think it was ready to start the final lap of the sprint race. Goes or tries to go down the inside of Alex Albon, hits a wet patch of the track and just loses control of the car. He spins off the track, makes contact with the barriers. He very nearly hits Alex Albon. Like, that could have very easily swallowed up Albon into that mess as he was sailing across the track. Crashes into the barriers again, and my heart stopped for a minute. My heart really stopped for a minute when he crashed, because it was a brutal crash. I think on the telemetry, Bortoleto was sitting about 319 kilometers an hour when he went to go for the move on Albon. His first impact with the barriers was registered at 34G, and his second impact was registered at 56G. My heart actually stopped watching it. It was just one of those moments where you just stop breathing, because you've got no idea if this person's okay or not. And the images that have come out of the crash are insane. I've seen it from so many different angles, from onboards, from people in the grandstands, and the fact that Bortoleto managed to get out of the car, was medically cleared, and then was seen like running down the pit lane at one point, looking fine, is just a testament to how safety has improved so much in Formula One, and the measures that these teams and everything go to make sure that the drivers are as safe as they can be in those cars. This could have been a very different scenario that we're talking about, and due to the incredible safety measures, Bortoleto stepped out of that car okay. And the sense of relief I felt when I seen Bortoleto getting out of the car, because honestly, I stopped breathing. Brutal. So brutal. And I'm so happy that he got out of the car. And as I said, it's just a complete testament to the safety in Formula One these days, because it could have gone a very different direction. I also want to give a huge shout out to the Cyber Mechanics for 2 incredible repair jobs. Well, it'll actually be 3 now since Bortoleto crashed in the main race. But an absolutely amazing job from the Cyber Mechanics to get Bortoleto's car back and get it repaired. I know he didn't manage to take part in quali, but to get it repaired to the fact that he was sitting in the car in Q1, like, if they'd only had a smidge more time, they could have maybe gotten him out. It's a shame that he didn't get out, obviously, and he didn't actually manage to get a time set for qualifying, but my God, the work that those mechanics would have done to get that car ready. I mean, it was a complete rebuild. And it amazed me when I heard Jonathan Wheatley speaking, being like, we might be able to get Bortoleto out, but, the car's on a knife edge. We don't know quite yet. And, it was just that little bit too late for them to get it turned around. I mean, either way, it was an incredible job by the Cyber Mechanics, only for Bortoleto to DNF in the main race as well. Kind of through his own fault, I have to say. He went to go for a wee move on Lance Stroll, got squeezed because he stuck his front wing into a space where it was pretty clear that Stroll was closing the gap, and it meant that he clipped the barrier. Again, and that was him out. He broke his front left, I think it was, steering column, and that was the end of Bortoleto's race, which is such a shame. Such a shame, because I had such high hopes for Bortoleto going into this weekend. He's been performing pretty well. I know his performance has kind of fallen off a little bit coming out of the European season, and he has struggled a little bit, but I just really thought that the fact that it was his home race and all that support would really kind of spur him on a little bit, and maybe not for the sprint, but for the main race to try and score a couple of points in. But it's just been a complete disaster. A complete disaster for Bortoleto, and I'm devastated for him. Absolutely devastated. Nico Hülkenberg, bit of a better weekend. I mean, a much better weekend compared to Bortoleto. Qualifying 10th for both races. In the sprint, he luckily, doesn't DNF and manages to finish 15th. He, similar to Colapinto, similar to Oscar Piastri, rides the curb going into turn 3, loses control of the car, crashes into the barrier. Manages to actually get going again. I thought it was going to be a clean DNF. His front wing was broken, his rear wing was broken, but manages to get back to the pits, uses the red flag to the advantage so that the mechanics can fit new front wings and get it all repaired and everything, and he manages to continue to take part in the race. Again, an amazing job by the Cyber Mechanics to get the car fixed and get it into a state that it can go back out on track. I think the Cyber Mechanics are the real MVPs of the Sao Paulo GP this weekend, because they've done incredible work and they've absolutely smashed it. So they should be very proud of themselves. It's a shame they had to go to the lengths to get all this done, but they absolutely nailed it. And then in the main race, qualifies 10th, finishes 9th. I have to say, I don't think that was too bad a finishing position, considering that he was on a one-stop race. I mean, by the time you're getting to the end of the race, everyone else around you is on much fresher tyres, apart from Liam Lawson. But I think it's a pretty decent job for him to be able to hold on to P9, considering how worn his tyres would have been. I think it was a decent race for him. He had some brilliant battles out on track. There was this sort of midfield fight between Lawson, Hülkenberg, Hajar, Gasly, Behrman, where they were just fighting. It was just this group fighting one another, and there was some phenomenal battles out on track. And I think it was a nice wee race from Hülkenberg. Thankfully, one half of the Cyber Garage managed to score some points, because we're obviously getting into the business end of the season in the championship. The Constructors is getting so close. Haas have managed to jump Cyber and are now sitting 8 points ahead of them. And what looked to be like a very promising year for Cyber, they're still sitting P9. I mean, they're an absolute country mile ahead of Alpine, to be fair, but I kind of was wanting them to finish just a little bit higher. In fact, it's just actually not been a great weekend. It's a couple of points. It's 2 points in the whole weekend for Cyber, and it's just not good enough. All right, next up is Williams, and Alex Albon, who qualified for the sprint in 12th, finished 17th, qualified for the main race in 12th, finished 11th, and Carlos Sainz, who qualified for the sprint 20th, finished 14th, and qualified for the main race 15th, finished 13th. A fairly poor weekend from both the Williams drivers, to be honest. Carlos didn't really seem on top of the car throughout the majority of the weekend. Albon not having a great time out there either. Strategy calls this weekend were fairly poor. A bad strategy for Alex Albon in the main race, and a fairly bad strategy actually for Carlos. I think both the drivers were on different strategies, and actually neither of them worked. And Carlos obviously had a pretty bad pit stop in the main race, which really just compounded an already poor weekend. Again, as I said, the driver's not really seeming entirely comfortable in the car. Bad strategy calls from the pit wall, not great for Williams, and I don't really have much more to say about them. Next up, we have VCarb and Liam Lawson, who qualified for the sprint in 17th, finished 16th, and qualified for the main race in 7th, finished 7th, and Isaac Hajar, who qualified for the sprint in 9th, finished 10th, and qualified for the main race in 5th, finished 8th. It was a pretty poor qualifying performance for the sprint for Liam Lawson, and then he gets handed a 5-second penalty for causing a collision with Oliver Bearman. And the penalty, to be fair, is part 2 in a 2-part story. Bearman also getting a penalty for dangerous driving, squeezing Lawson onto the grass. Lawson then, however, going down the inside of turn 4, I think it was, tags Bearman, spins him off, and unfortunately that is a penalty through no fault of his own. I know that he was fairly upset with the whole, getting squeezed off the track. Bearman was penalised for that. Lawson has to be penalised for tagging Bearman, unfortunately. Isaac Hajar faring a little bit better in the sprint, qualifying 9th, finishing 10th, just outside the points, kind of looking in, but not a bad result altogether. Could have been a lot worse, could have been a lot better. For the main race, I have to say both the drivers, fantastic qualifyings. Absolutely fantastic qualifyings. And when you put it into perspective that Max and Yuki were both out in Q1, the fact that the sister team has made it into Q3 and is sitting 5th and 7th is nothing short of amazing. And it just goes to show that, yes, these are sister teams, but their philosophy on the cars are completely different. And every weekend there seems to be some sort of problems and issues with the Red Bulls of how aggressive and everything it is, where you're not seeing that at VCarb. And this is the kind of worry with Isaac Hajar potentially stepping into that Red Bull. Going from a car that seems to handle very well and drives very well and, they're getting great results out of it, to then go into something that's going to be really aggressive in your second year is a tall order. It's a big ask, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, fantastic qualifying result from both him and Liam Lawson. Lawson, obviously fighting for a seat, and I do think it is going to be confirmed. I don't think we'll see anything by the end of the season. I think Red Bull will wait until after Abu Dhabi, get that out of the way, and then they'll announce who's partnering Max and the two VCarb drivers. I do think Lawson will be safe. He's been putting in some pretty decent performances this year, so I think he should be grand. In terms of the actual race, as I said, Lawson, Hajar sort of in that midfield pack where there's just constant battling happening. I don't think Isaac Hajar and Pierre Gasly stopped battling for about a solid third, maybe more of the race. They were constantly going at one another throughout the whole thing. Lawson as well, very much in that fight with the likes of Hulkenberg, with the likes of Bearman. It was fantastic driving from both of these boys out there. I have to also say a fantastic drive from Liam Lawson to pull off a one-stopper. I do think it is a brilliant result, to be fair, going for the one-stop when everyone else around you is doing the two stops. I will say, however, now I missed this, but apparently there was contact between Isaac Hajar and Liam Lawson going, I think, into turn 1 of the final lap, and I don't know if we'd seen it. Martin Brundle did say, however, that it looked a bit personal. So I don't know whether it was Hajar going in for an overtake and Lawson maybe trying to defend. I don't really know, but interesting. And it's a driver pairing that I don't expect to see tensions fraying, but I am interested in this little squabble. I'm going to have to try and find it somewhere because I don't think it was shown. And if it was, I completely missed it. Maybe I was just too caught up in the Max Verstappen of it all. But it's a fairly solid result. I mean, I do sometimes expect them to be a little bit higher. And I think with both the Ferraris DNFing, there was definitely a bigger opportunity for them to be sitting up and around the sort of top 5 spots. I'm not saying a podium, but, you know, potentially a P5, P6. But a P7, P8 is grand. Next up, we have Haas and Esteban Ocon, who qualified for the sprint in 19th, finished 11th. Qualified for the main race 17th, started from the pit lane, finished 12th. And Ollie Bearman, who qualified for the sprint in 15th, finished 12th. Qualified for the main race in 8th and finished 6th. Listen, I don't think it was a terrible race for Esteban Ocon. You know, starting in the pit lane, he's finished 12th. And I don't think there was ever really going to be a chance of him to score points, considering he started in the pit lane. I know what Max Verstappen has just done. Esteban Ocon is no Max Verstappen. Let's be real about that. What I do want to talk about is Oliver Bearman, who, oh my God, once again, what a bloody brilliant race. I'm so impressed by Bearman these past couple of races. And listen, there seems to have been a little bit of a trend with some of the rookies that whenever they have a fantastic result and a brilliant race, the next race is a shocker. And I kind of thought that after the P4 highs in Mexico for Bearman, it was all going to kind of come crashing down in Brazil, especially since last year he spent the majority of the race, as I said, facing the wrong direction. Call me pleasantly surprised. What a bloody brilliant result. I couldn't be happier for him. I honestly, at one point during the qualifying for the main race, thought he was going to be on pole position because he was threatening pole. And I mean, at one point he was on provisional pole and the rest of the drivers weren't really improving. And I thought, if Oliver Bearman gets pole position, I'm going to crack open a bottle of fizz because that is insane. It obviously wasn't to be. Everyone else seemed to sort of find a little bit of pace. However, I mean, starting 8th is still a pretty decent result for Bearman. And then just a brilliant race. A brilliant race. Some fantastic battling out on track. Like, really good, hard, but respectful racing. It was a pleasure watching him out on track today battling. And this is where I get so frustrated when I see Bearman having stupid, silly little mistakes and, you know, doing moves that are a little bit desperate, because I'm like, oh, I know you're great and you're showing us you're great. Where has this gone? And then, you know, I really get frustrated and I'm questioning him. And then we come to Brazil and Mexico and we have performances like we've had, and I'm like, there he is, let's go. I just think it was an outstanding race from Oliver Bearman. Absolutely outstanding. Finishing P6, 4th race in a row, finishing in the points. He was comfortably clear of the other midfielders today. And just absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Next up is Alpine. And Pierre Gasly, who qualified 13th for the sprint, finished 8th. Qualified 9th for the main race, finished 10th. And Franco Colapinto, who qualified 16th for the sprint, did not finish, and qualified 18th for the main race, finished 15th. I don't know what it is about Brazil and Pierre Gasly, but something just seems to gel. Like, it just seems... I don't know what it is about Brazil and Pierre Gasly, but something just seems to gel. Like, it just connects, and I don't get it, because, listen, I don't expect much from Alpine, and I haven't really expected much from Alpine at all this season. Not since we left pre-season testing in Bahrain, and it was fairly clear that that car was incredibly slow, and it has really sort of failed to perform nearly every single weekend. There has been the odd instance, like this weekend, where Gasly, what I will say, has managed to hook up an incredible one lap in that car, and he qualifies really well, and then it's about maintaining that position through the race. Rather than going on the offense, you're on the defense because you've gotten that great qualifying position. And I did not expect Alpine to run well around here, and, you know, Gasly managing to pick up a point in the sprint race and a point in the main race. That's 2 points. I didn't see these 2 points. And listen, I know the sprint race there was 3 DNFs, and I think there was 3 also in the main race. I just didn't expect Gasly to score points. I don't expect the Alpine to be sitting in the top 10 at all, and I'm pleasantly surprised that he's managed to pick up 2 points this weekend. I think it was a decent race, and I don't know what it is about Brazil, but something seems to gel for Gasly nearly every time we're here. I know this is not the podium finish of last year, but I'll take a P10 for Gasly in the main race and a point in the bag, because they are so few and far between the races in which the Alpine is capable of getting any points. Franco Colapinto, on the other hand, not a great weekend for him. He DNFs in the sprint race. Again, the similar sort of thing to Hulkenberg and Piastri, riding that curb going into turn 3 and losing the car. I will say that one, Colapinto had the biggest shunt out of all the drivers that crashed in succession there. And two, I actually think Colapinto was really struggling with the car way before he even got to that corner and sort of dipped a wheel onto the curb and slid on the water. He was struggling going into turn 1. You could see it on the replays, really wrestling that car. You could tell he wasn't comfortable, and he just, followed suit and dropped a wheel onto the watery curb. The main race, again, nothing to write home about, and I am hesitant to say that it is all down to Colapinto, because I do think that the majority of the problems facing Colapinto this year have been the car. It's not great. It's not great. We know it's not great. He has actually, I would say, in the past 6 races leading up to Brazil, he has performed very well, matching Pierre Gasly, if not outperforming Pierre Gasly. And I know we're talking about Gasly could be sitting 19th and Colapinto's 18th, but still, in the same machinery, he's doing fairly well. Obviously well enough that Colapinto has been given a shiny new contract for next year, which I think we all seen coming. It made logical sense to give Colapinto the contract this weekend in Brazil. It's the closest he's got to a home race. There will be so many Argentinian fans at Interlagos to watch Colapinto. I imagine there's quite a few of his personal sponsors and everything there as well, and people that have given a lot of money to the team. Because Colapinto's on it, it makes sense to give him a contract for next year. As I said, he's improved in the last 6 weekends leading into Brazil. Not really the result this weekend he would have wanted, especially when he's been given a new contract, but I do understand why Alpine have extended him into next year. And here's hoping that Alpine can give him a semi-decent car next year rather than the tractor he's driving this year. I also think that now that Colapinto's confirmed for the 2026 seat, it gives Jack Doohan some closure. Because Jack was given the seat, Jack got dropped. I would say, fairly unnecessary, and I don't think his performances were deserving of being dropped, but it felt like when Briatore took back control of the team, that was always going to happen. He was a big Colapinto fan, never really seemed to be a huge fan of Jack Doohan, and it was then Jack was in sort of no man's land of, am I going to be given another shot? Am I not? And I think now that we know that Colapinto's going to be there next year, it is a bit of closure for Doohan, and he can begin to move on to whatever it is next. Whether that is going to a different racing series, I doubt he will re-enter Formula One as a full-time driver. I mean, you never know, but I do think that if he wants a full-time seat, it needs to be in a different racing series. Moving on to Aston Martin, and Lance Stroll, who qualified for the sprint in 7th, finished 9th, and qualified for the main race 14th, finished 16th, and Fernando Alonso, who qualified for the sprint in 5th, finished 6th, and qualified for the main race in 11th, finished 14th. I have very little to say about Aston Martin actually this weekend. A pretty strong qualifying performance in the sprint, a nice, finish for Fernando Alonso to score some points. Shame for Lance Stroll, just missing out, sitting P9. Not the best result for the main qualifying. Q2, it's kind of where I expect them to be fair, with the sort of performances they've had the majority of this season. A Q2 exit seems to be the correct sort of spot for them. And then fairly anonymous throughout the majority of the race, finishing 14th and 16th. Nothing to really write home about. I don't expect there to be huge performances through the next 3 races. I might be wrong, but yeah, it is what it is. It's not been the best season for them, and this race was not the best race. as I said, fairly anonymous, and I've not got much to say about them. God, there always seems to be one team where I just don't have much. And this is Aston Martin this weekend. Moving on to Mercedes and George Russell, who qualified for the sprint in 4th, finished 3rd, qualified for the main race in 6th, finished 4th, and Kimi Antonelli, who qualified for the sprint in 2nd, finished 2nd, and qualified for the main race in 2nd, finished 2nd. I do think that George has had a very good drive this weekend across both the races. Decent qualifyings, decent race results, a big haul of points. However, he has been massively overshadowed by his teammate qualifying 2nd for both races and finishing 2nd for both races. He has massively outshone George Russell, and you would expect that Russell would be the one putting in, sitting 2nd to Lando Norris throughout this weekend, and unfortunately he's just not been that on it. Kimi has looked far more comfortable in the car this weekend. George has really sort of struggled, and even when, if you take the main race, for example, when Max Verstappen arrived to the back of George Russell, he managed to dispatch of George very, very easily. However, it was a lot harder to get past Antonelli, and I understand that his tyres will have, degraded a little bit more by the time he got to Antonelli, and so it would have been a little bit harder. But I expected George to put up the defensive fight that Kimi Antonelli did, and he didn't. But it's still a decent result from George. I think he's done a great job in qualifying, a great job in the races. It's just, he's been outshined by his teammate Kimi Antonelli, who has had a outstanding weekend. A bloody brilliant weekend. Oh my God. Oh, I was just really worried for Kimi Antonelli. I did not expect him to stick at P2 in either qualifying session, and I did not expect him to hang on to those P2s through either race. And in the sprint race, he really kind of came alive in the closing stages. He'd done a lot of defensive driving up until that, and then he really sort of went on the attack and was trying to close down Lando. And again, if he had won that race, I would have been popping champagne, because that would have been a story. That would have been incredible. And yeah, I would have probably gotten drunk that night. However, P2, a phenomenal result. And then to go and do the exact same thing in the main race. And he did a superb drive by Kimi Antonelli. Absolutely incredible. I've got no notes. I can't fault it. I think he was absolutely insane. It was a defensive masterclass out there. He didn't succumb to the pressure that was getting put on him from drivers well more experienced than himself, in terms of Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, George Russell, Max Verstappen, who's just come from the pit lane and is now sitting behind you in P3. Like, the talent that was on display from a lot of these drivers today was incredible, and Kimi Antonelli was sitting at the top of that pile. Insane. I have to say, I really thought that Mercedes had thrown away a decent result from Antonelli when they brought him into pit, and it meant that he would rejoin the race in a ton of traffic. But when he got those new boots on, he was absolutely flying out there. He was so fast. He was picking drivers off. Incredible battles. Amazing, amazing driving. And it resulted in a stellar result in a P2. A fantastic result from Kimi Antonelli. Absolutely incredible. Like, a superb drive, exceptionally executed, that resulted in a very well-deserved P2 podium. I couldn't be happier for him. I genuinely couldn't be happier for him. And as I said, completely outshined his teammate. I didn't expect Kimi to drive as well as he did today. And I'm actually incredibly excited for Kimi now, going into Vegas, where that Mercedes should be at the top of the pecking order. We know when it comes to cooler conditions, that Mercedes thrives. And I do expect them to run very, very well. Considering how great Mercedes ran last year and that it was a 1-2, Could we be looking at a Mercedes 1-2? Could we be looking at Kimi Antonelli winning the Vegas GP? I can't. I actually can't. It would be too much. It would be too much. That's my birthday weekend, and if he won it, my God, would I be going Tonto. Fuck me, I should have gotten tickets for it. Imagine if I'd been turning 30 in Vegas and Kimi Antonelli was winning races. Don't. I can't. I actually can't. Anyway, what a race from Kimi Antonelli. What a race. Next up, we have Red Bull and Max Verstappen, who qualified for the sprint in 6th, finished 4th, qualified for the main race 16th, started from the pit lane, finished 3rd, and Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified for the sprint in 18th, finished 13th, qualified for the main race in 19th, finished 17th. Right, we've got a lot to unpack with this one, don't we? Jesus, what a weekend for Red Bull Racing. And by saying that, I mean, what a weekend for Max Verstappen. Absolutely insane work this weekend. And listen, I thought it was all going to go tits up when the sprint was fine. It was nothing really to write home about. Like, all right, it's a qualifying in 6th, finished 4th. Sure. Okay. Then he has a, quite frankly, dreadful qualifying for the main race. Is sitting 16th, out in Q1. He's out in Q1. It is the first time that Max Verstappen has ever been out in Q1 on pure pace. Every other time Verstappen has been knocked out in Q1 is because of something to do with issues to the power unit, or his engine cover blowing off, or the fact that he just decides not to set a time. Never has he been knocked out in Q1 on pure pace. Never has he been knocked out in Q1 on pure pace alone until this weekend. And I don't know what was wrong with that Red Bull that he was struggling so much that for the first time in his Formula One career, he's knocked out in Q1 on pace. I was shocked. Shocked, horrified, and I was in disbelief at what I was seeing when Verstappen didn't make it out of Q1. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I actually thought that it was a joke. I was like, this is funny. Timing towers failed. You know, the timing tower's not working right. No. It was working fine. He was just that bad on pace. And listen, Max had been struggling through the entirety of the weekend. Through FP1, through the sprint quali, through the actual sprint, and Yuki Tsunoda was being used as a bit of a guinea pig for trialing different setups to inform the setup for Max Verstappen's car. So now Yuki went into the sprint with a much softer and a much higher configuration, much higher setup, and the initial reports I'd seen were that it had worked. It had worked, and that Yuki's setup would be sort of getting transferred over to Max Verstappen's car. Now, the initial reports I'd seen coming into the main qualifying was that that setup had worked. It had worked on Yuki's car, and they were going to then implement it on Max's car. Then as qualifying for the main race got underway, it was clear that actually that wasn't the case, and that Yuki Tsunoda had opted for the same setup as Max Verstappen, and that the team had decided to do other configuration changes, setup changes to the cars to help fix the balance and whatnot, rather than rear wings and everything like that being changed. And it was clear that whatever they had done hadn't really worked because both the drivers were out in Q1. So whatever direction that they'd taken this Red Bull in, not only was it not working for Yuki Tsunoda, but Yuki just doesn't seem to be able to drive this car. It was not working for Max, a man that has been able to deliver some incredible results with that Red Bull. They break Parc Fermé, and there is some hefty work going on to that Red Bull. He obviously has to start from the pit lane. He takes an entirely new engine, which, to be fair, he tends to do quite a lot in Brazil, but it's a whole new engine and a completely different setup on the car, and that clearly works because he manages to go from the pit lane to P3. Now, I don't think that that's the best result that anyone's done from starting in the pit lane. I think the best result is a P2 finish, and that if Max had gotten that P2, he would have equaled the best result. No one, however, has started from the pit lane and gone on and won a race. And it did genuinely look like Max was going to break yet another record by winning this race. And at one point, it seemed like Max was going to one stop and he was just going to make his car as wide as possible so that Lando Norris couldn't get past him. Unfortunately, he couldn't really afford to do that because of how much more fresher Lando Norris's tyres were, and everyone else was then sort of coming in for second stops. He would have kind of been a bit of a sitting duck. I will say that one, Red Bull nailed the strategy, and two, Max nailed the drive. Absolutely nailed the drive. As soon as he got out that pit lane when the race started, he was picking drivers off. By the time the safety car had come out, he was sitting P16. By the time the virtual safety car had come out, he was sitting P13. He did then have to pit because he got a puncture, but then by lap 19, he was in the top 10. There genuinely wasn't any stopping him, and he did manage to sort of benefit from other drivers in front of him, sort of two at a time, going into the pits, and he sort of managed to jump that way. But regardless, it was a sensational drive. It was a generational drive from Max Verstappen today. That is something you do not see all the time. And listen, I mean, he had a fantastic result last year as well and sort of came through the field. But we are watching a generational talent at work here. And it is such a joy to watch him. And listen, I know that Max gets a bad rep for being aggressive and bending the rules. And, you know, I think everyone, or a large portion of people, got a little bit bored of Max during 2023 because he was winning everything. And it was like, oh, not him again. But you cannot deny the talent that that man has. And, you know, he is a driver at heart. And last year, after his race in Brazil, I said that that was maybe one of the top 5 drives of all time. And I would say that this race sits close, but maybe not the same. You know, the conditions were massively different last year. We had qualifying a few hours before the actual race started. Like, it was chaos. Absolute chaos. However, that is not to take away from what we've just watched, which is a generational talent pulling off one of the most insane drives and managing to go from the pit lane to P3. It was such a pleasure and a joy to watch it. I had so much fun. At one point, like, I sit and write all my notes out for this to make sure that I've got as much information as I can. At one point, I just stopped writing because I was fixated on Max Verstappen trying to get Kimi Antonelli. I was on the edge of my seat. I couldn't get enough of it. I didn't want it to stop. I would have actually loved nothing more than if Max Verstappen had gone and won that race. Purely for the spectacle of him going from the pit lane to finishing on, like, top step of the podium. That would have been fireworks. I will now only accept Max Verstappen starting the Brazilian GP from the pit lane or the back of the grid. I don't want him starting P1. I don't want him starting, you know, front row or in the top 5. I don't want any of that. I want him down the back. I want him as far back as possible in the pit lane, right? Because I would happily watch that man fight his way through all 20 or 19 drivers to get there, because that was sensational. Sensational. I enjoyed every second of it. I could watch it every single day. Every single day I could watch Max Verstappen do stuff like that because it is incredible. And for Yuki Tsunoda, well, listen, I understand his sprint race was never really going to be anything of note because he was testing things out for Max Verstappen. He was there purely as a guinea pig. However, when it came to the main race, it just all completely unraveled for him. He picks up a 10-second time penalty for causing a collision with Lance Stroll. He was coming up behind Franco Colapinto, and I think they all might have braked a bit earlier than he expected. He swerved out the way to miss Franco Colapinto going into one of the corners and ended up tagging Lance Stroll. It's an accident, but it is 10-second time penalty worthy, unfortunately. He then gets another 10-second time penalty for failing to serve his 10-second time penalty correctly. And Red Bull have taken ownership of that. They were like, listen, it was us. We kind of touched the car before. We should have. It's a shame because when Yuki is struggling so much, he could really afford not to have these, you know, these mistakes in these instances happening. But yeah, not one to remember for Yuki Tsunoda. Speaking of races that you won't want to remember, Ferrari. And Charles Leclerc, who qualified 8th for the sprint, finished 5th, qualified 3rd for the main race, did not finish. And Lewis Hamilton, who qualified 11th for the sprint, finished 7th, qualified 13th for the main race, did not finish. I said this the other day, but I think I've reached the acceptance stage with Ferrari because I kind of feel nothing anymore. Isn't that what they say? Acceptance is one of the stages of grief. I feel like I'm in acceptance. Like I'm just accepting of the fact that Ferrari are just not going to have great weekends this year. I'd be quite happy if Ferrari just packed it all up. Wrap this shit up. Let's just, move it on to 2026. In fact, actually, being a Ferrari fan this weekend has been a complete roller coaster because Ferrari have done so dismally bad in Formula One, but they've done amazing in endurance, where they are manufacturers' champions. So, you got to kind of weigh it all up. Lewis Hamilton obviously knocked out in Q2 for both the sprint and the main race. He was noted by the stewards for a yellow flag infringement when Charles Leclerc had spun off during Q2 for the main race. He failed to slow down, was noted by the stewards, and didn't receive any penalties from the stewards, which is an interesting one. Because I do think the stewards have opened themselves up here to other teams saying, well, you didn't penalise Hamilton for it, so why are you penalising us? And these things are usually fairly slam dunk penalties. You can tell by the telemetry and from where they're around the track. I do just feel like there is a huge inconsistency with the stewarding decisions at the moment. We had it last weekend in Mexico with Hamilton getting a penalty but Verstappen getting no penalty, and now we come to this weekend and the shoe's on the other foot with Hamilton not receiving a penalty when he probably should have. And I do think that the stewards are just really intent on opening themselves up to a lot of criticism from fans, from other teams. Cut to the main race. The race start. Hamilton and Carlos have a bit of contact, damages Lewis's car, and then he goes to try and make a move on Franco Colapinto, clips the back of Colapinto, breaks his front wing, ends up getting brought into the pits for a new front wing, and I don't know why Ferrari didn't just decide to retire the car then and there. And listen, I understand why Lewis wouldn't have wanted to retire. It's a big race for Lewis, and in turn it's now a big race for Ferrari. And I mean, well, every race right now is a big race for Ferrari because they're in such a tight constructors battle with Red Bull and Mercedes, who have both jumped Ferrari. Ferrari's now sitting fourth. However, it was clear that the damage on Lewis's car, he was never going to be able to score any type of points. He had such a loss in downforce that it was sliding all about the track. You could see it. And I just don't know why again, they didn't decide to bring him in, just retire the car. They left him, they put him out, they let him keep going, they bring him in again and give him a fresh set of tyres, only for him to then retire the car a few laps later. It doesn't make any sense to me. I just think they should have cut their losses. Yes, it's a complete disaster for Ferrari considering that both the drivers DNF'd, but what's the point in leaving him out there to as he said, I'm going to crash this car because I cannot keep handle of it. It made no sense to me. And as soon as he had contact, those first two bits of contact, and it was clear that the floor of the car was damaged, I was like, they need to just retire this car. They need to do it. I understand not wanting to do it because maybe something might happen, but it was clear that this was never going to be a decent race from him when he came out of the pit, and he was all over the place, sliding about everywhere, had such a loss in downforce, was so slow, it just wasn't going to work for him. And I just don't know why Ferrari decided to leave him out as long as they did. I've also had some people in my comments saying that, Carlos intentionally ruined Lewis's race by crashing into him on lap 1, and Carlos should be penalised for crashing into Lewis, and oh God, can we take the tinfoil hats off, please? Carlos Sainz did not intentionally make contact with Lewis Hamilton to ruin his race. It just didn't happen. It's a lap 1, turn 1 incident. That is why he did not get a penalty for the contact. These comments have also said that, Lewis would have been on the podium today if it hadn't been for Carlos Sainz. And I have to say, it would have taken a lot more than a clean race for that Ferrari to have been on the podium. Gen up. It would have taken so much more than Lewis Hamilton having an entirely clean race today for him to be stood on any step of that podium. And I'm saying that as a Ferrari fan. Not a great weekend for Hamilton. Not a great weekend for Leclerc. you know, an all right result in the sprint. It's P5, couple of points in the bag, capitalising on some DNFs. Lovely. Then a pretty decent result, actually, I would say, for the main qualifying, sitting third. I didn't expect that at all. Seemed to have found something in the car that he kind of gelled with a little bit, managed to get a bit of extra pace out of it. We love to see it. And then he DNF'd, which I actually feel a bit bad for him because it was through no fault of his own that it happened. Oscar Piastri going up the inside of Kimi Antonelli, tags Kimi Antonelli into Charles Leclerc, who next thing, fucking wheels come off, it's rolling away, and, you know, I think he broke his suspension, and, you know, he's DNF'd as well. God, shite day to be a Ferrari fan, isn't it? Listen, I mean, you know what it is. We're now fourth in the championship. You know, we might be able to scrape third, maybe. But, you know, if George Russell and Kimi Antonelli are performing very well, I can't see us being able to fight that. We might be able to fight a Max Verstappen because Yuki's not really scoring much points. But I'm not holding out my hopes. You know, I'm not getting my hopes high. And finally, McLaren with Lando Norris, who qualified for the sprint first, finished first, qualified for the main race first, finished first, and Oscar Piastri, who qualified for the sprint in third, did not finish, and qualified for the main race in fourth, finished fifth. I think it was a much better weekend for Oscar Piastri than what we've seen, obviously. I don't know what exactly the problems were through those North American races. It was never really something that he was going to do that well, and he's very open about saying that he struggles at those tracks. And I mean, to be fair, he's really sort of struggled since Baku. Yeah, since Baku. Baku, Singapore, Mexico, Brazil. Not Brazil. Austin have really just not been his races. Things looked a bit better this weekend, I have to say. Unfortunate, you know, it's a DNF in the sprint race through driver error. I've seen a lot of people being like, Lando Norris' fault, and oh my God, Lando did this so that Oscar would crash. And, you know, the sort of running theory is that Lando had sort of pulled up some water at that point by riding the curb at turn 3. Kimi Antonelli had come over the radio and been like, Lando's pulling up water and what have you. And then Oscar, right after that, has hit that little patch of water on the curb, spun off. So's Hulkenberg, so's Colapinto. I don't think Lando's doing it on purpose, babe. I don't think he's been like, do you know what I'm going to do? Get a bit of water up on that track. That'll sort Piastri out. The amount of drivers that would have driven over that part of the curb to pull the water onto the curb from the grass. There's so many. So many. We can't just put the sole blame on Lando Norris. It's not the case. I'm really sorry. And it's a bit of an accident. It's what happens. It's Formula One. It's racing. It's a wet track. That is what happens. And it's unfortunate, but that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. And what I will say is he didn't really let it. I was a bit worried that it would knock his confidence a little bit. It does feel like the ice cold demeanour of Oscar Piastri is ever so slightly melting. Maybe more than ever so slightly, but that it is melting, and you can see that things are getting to him and affecting him. Whereas before, it was just, he was almost stoic in his approach to racing. Whereas now it's clear that, you know, he is in his mind about it, and it has gotten into him a little bit. What I will say is I don't agree with Race Control's decision to implement a rolling start for the restart of the sprint race rather than a standing start. One, I don't understand it because we'd already started the race through a standing start, and I've seen the things online about how because we've been racing there is a dry racing line and then the rest of the track is wet. I'm sorry, I call that racing. What? We can't micromanage all of these situations. Listen, I understand that there is a thing about safety. I understand that we don't want everything to just be about entertainment. However, just give us a standing start. You've already done it. We've already had a standing start. Give us another one. We don't need this rolling start nonsense. I just felt it was a bit unnecessary, to be honest. I don't think we needed to have a rolling start for a race where it's not rained anymore. And we've already started it on a standing start. And listen, as I said, it doesn't need to just all be about entertainment, but the restart or the start of a race is always the most entertaining part, or one of the most entertaining parts, sorry. All 20 cars off the line, diving into the first corner. It is spicy, it's feisty, but we love it. And I just can't help but feel there was just no need for us to lose that for a fucking rolling start. Who's wanting that? Not me. Anyway, it was a P4 qualifying for the main race, and not a bad race, I would say, in general. He did pick up a 10-second time penalty, which I do think is maybe a bit extreme for what it was. It was the reason that Leclerc was out the race, and I think maybe that's why it was a 10-second, because the actual incident itself wasn't that bad. He's going down the inside of Antonelli into turn one. It's a bit late, locks up, and, nudges Antonelli. Is it really that bad? Like, I understand he's not in control of his car, but I would say it's a 5-seconder at best. But then, it ruined Leclerc's race, so maybe that's why he got the 10-second. But it just doesn't feel like it was the right one. It feels like it was a bit harsh. I think it was an alright race. It wasn't a complete disaster like we've had for the past few race weekends. It's been alright, but nothing to write home about. I mean, he's now sitting 24 points behind Lando. So I would say the fight is very much between these two drivers. I don't think Max will be able to turn it round. I do think he's still in mathematical contention, but I think it's between the two drivers. I think Max is out of it now. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in Vegas next time, and then we go to Qatar, which should really suit both McLaren drivers and that car. So, could be fun there, but it's definitely going down to the wire, it feels like, in Abu Dhabi. Because although Oscar is being outscored by Lando, right now it's not enough to seal the championship. So, yeah, not a terrible race. Nothing really to write home about. It was fine. It's actually quite nice to have a race weekend where I'm not moaning or complaining really about McLaren decisions. They didn't really interfere this weekend. They left the boys to it, which was quite nice. Lando Norris, on it from the absolute get-go, on it through qualifying, on it through the sprint, and qualifying again, and the sprint, just on top of it. Some of those quali lap times were insanely impressive. A clean sweep across the weekend, and just absolutely nailed it. He nailed it, and I'm very impressed by it. I think he's back, found his rhythm, found his form again, and is, he's got a bit of a groove going with that car. And to go from winning the Mexican GP by 30 seconds to come and clean sweep the Brazilian GP in tricky conditions with, a lot of battling going on everywhere and chaos, DNFs, crashes, wet tracks, and to hold your own, not really crumble, and just sort of go for it. I'm very impressed by Lando Norris. I think he's done a great job. Very well deserved pole positions from some incredible laps, some of the best laps I've seen. And then to go and win the races with some superb drives. I do think Lando's getting a little bit of an unfair shtick at the moment. I've seen quite a lot of comments of people saying, if Lando Norris wins the championship, he'll be the most mediocre driver to have ever won a championship before. And I just don't think that's fair. Listen, I'm not a huge Lando Norris fan. I can appreciate he's a good driver. He's had some incredible races. A lot of people say, well, why hasn't he been doing this before? And it's because, McLaren's been in a rebuilding phase for so long. They brought him in. He's been trained for this moment. He's one of the most what's the word? Like, he was literally molded to be ready to be an F1 driver. He starts F1, he joins a team and sticks with a team that are, going through a massive restructure, rebuild, trying to get back to the front, has endured many a bad car at that team, and has now finally got the car to be able to go and win it. And listen, do I agree with everything that's happened this season when it comes to McLaren? And no, and I think a lot of my frustrations are never actually to do with the drivers. They're to do with the team. And it's mostly because I kind of just, I don't really like Zak Brown. And the decision and the meddling from McLaren have really irritated me. But I can't blame the drivers for that. And I do think he's driving very well. And I think it's a bit far to call him mediocre. Let's be honest. Listen, he is no Max Verstappen. But he's doing a damn good job out there. And that is everything from us. We will be back fairly soon for our next race. It's the Vegas GP. It is also the weekend of my 30th birthday. So that'll be a fun one. I don't know how I'm going to navigate that. We don't know. Well, I don't know what's going to happen. We shall wait and see. But that could be fun. But thank you very much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the Brazilian GP and sprint race in the comments down below. I'll see you very soon. Make sure to follow at Parc Fermé Parlay for all the Formula 1 updates. I'll see you very soon. Love you. Bye.